these days. Hi, Brian.
It's light at about 4:30 now.
I know.
4:30, 5 o'clock.
It's short days for sure.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Brian.
Hello, Rabbi.
How are you?
I'm good. And sorry, I have the light on, so I have to go to video. The video looks absent. I look absent, but you see, this is what I look like.
That's fine. We don't mind. We love seeing you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No matter what you look like, it doesn't matter. Hi, Marnie.
Hi.
Hi, Marnie.
Good to see you.
Hi. Good to see you too.
That won't stop the recording?
So this is the last day of the quarantine?
Yes, today's the last day of quarantine for Matt. And so we have a hike planned for tomorrow. We're just going to be outside, get him out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know where you're going to go hiking?
Yeah, we live on the North Shore.
Oh yeah, me too.
Close to the Cleveland Dam.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do that hike a lot, or up there and back. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Nice.
So you live on the North Shore too?
Yeah, well, I have an apartment there. I'm temporarily living in Terrace right now, but I have an apartment on the North Shore. Yeah.
Oh.
Right in the near the Lynn Valley area.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, nice to meet you, Grace.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Good evening.
Hi, Vina.
Rena, you look a little cold. Is the air conditioner on?
No, we had our second shot today.
Good for
I
you.
think we're suffering from second shot exhaustion. But we're very excited that we have finally had our second shot.
Yeah.
Yeah, very exciting.
Somebody told me on the phone today that they were very excited because you could now have 50 people together. I said, I don't know 50 people, so it doesn't help.
I think that Canada's getting 9 million shots this week.
Wow.
Read that in the paper, yeah.
What's that?
That there's 9 million shots coming in from Moderna and Pfizer.
It was very busy. We went to the Italian Cultural Center and it was just constant.
Huge line.
I understand they're giving out free pasta with every shot.
Hi, Arnold. Hi, NASA.
Is that
a
true?
cup of coffee anyway.
What's that?
But you could buy a lasagna for $50 if you wanted to.
Hi, Arnold and NASA.
A lasagna, a big lasagna, I take it.
Big lasagna. They said it would feed 8 people.
Wow. Wow.
But it probably had meat in it. So
We didn't buy it.
We didn't buy it. Yeah.
I'm letting people in as they come in. My our speaker for this evening, Paul Shrell-Fox, Dr. Rabbi, has arrived.
Aha.
All right.
Great.
You'll have to bear with him because he lives in Israel, so he's going to work on his English tonight.
Can't hear you.
One of the things you'll need to do though is unmute. Yes.
Yeah, I did that. Right, I noticed that. Yeah, I have 2 second languages. After living here in Israel for about 27, 28 years, I have, actually I have English, which is close to what you guys speak. I guess we do better between the United States and Canada than between the both of us and the UK. But I have two second languages, no first language, and sometimes it just comes out in a language that someone says say that again in my language, but whatever it is, we'll deal with it. It works.
What's the other second language?
Hebrew.
Oh, you said there are two. So English, Hebrew, and
English at this point.
English is second and Hebrew is second. I have two second languages.
What's your mother tongue?
My mother speaks English. 27 years of speaking primarily in Hebrew. My English is not as good as it might have been.
So English is your mother tongue.
Right. I grew up for the first 30 years primarily English. Now for the past 27 years, I speak both. We speak English at home with our kids. I lecture, international lectures I give, in English. But as a psychologist, and when I was teaching at Machon Shechter here in Jerusalem, and in other academic institutions, I teach in Hebrew. So every so often the sentence comes to me in the other language, and I have to stop and think and then translate it. And you'll get that sense. My eyes kind of glaze over. I don't know how well it'll come out here over Zoom, but that's just fine.
97%.
So, Paul, you just went to the right side of my screen. You're on the left side of my screen. I don't know if that's, so why don't we begin? I'm going to continue letting people in, but we have Dr. Paul Shrell-Fox with us, Rabbi Dr. Paul Shrell-Fox. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we met and how we got to know each other. And we really got to know each other very well many years ago. And it was actually because of Paul's act of chesed, of kindness to me, that we really got to know each other so well. So I was living in Israel, going to Machon Shechter, to the conservative rabbinical school in Jerusalem. And at the same time, Dr. Shrell-Fox, Rabbi Shrell-Fox, was also in attendance at rabbinical school. And he actually lived in East Talpiot, which is across the street. By the way, he lives almost exactly across the street from Rabbi Solomon and Phyllis, or pretty close to them.
Right. Yeah, it's we're about a 12-minute walk.
So right in the neighborhood. And I was living in Talpiot, and so I was actually sort of just right on the way to Shechter in the morning, and Paul owned this wonderful Volvo. I don't know, do you still have it?
It was a 1974 Volvo sedan. So
with automatic doors, if I remember correctly.
Right, they automatically closed when you wanted them to.
and he picked me up very kindly every day and took me to school, which was very, and so we were in the car every morning together. And actually, I remember the one wonderful Hebrew line that I remember learning from Dr. Paul Shrell-Fox was, "Oh, that person must be patur minator," which means, oh, that person is exempt from waiting in the line. They can just illegally drive onto the sidewalk, go around everyone else, and then continue on their way. And in the time that we were spent in the car, I got to know Paul really well as both a mensch and someone who is really bright. And he'll tell us a little bit more about what he's been doing now. But in the army, he had a fascinating job of determining whether or not someone who is claiming to be who's claiming to have mental illness issues really did have mental illness issues, or really was just trying to get out of the army. But with that being said, of course, I think it's important for me to say that we know that mental health is something that we all deal with, even pre-COVID-19. And it really is at the heart, I think, of many of the challenges that we all face in life. And during this time period of COVID-19, it's really been exacerbated. And so we have an opportunity to learn from really an expert of a true, I believe, a marriage of need of mental health and Judaism. And so I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Rabbi Paul Shrell-Fox and ask you maybe to tell us a little bit more about yourself as well and what you've been doing since we spent all that time in the car. I guess it's about, what, 10 years ago now? Or no, a little more than that.
A little more than that.
Yeah, I think it
cars
was,
that have replaced that Volvo is probably close to
20. It was actually 21 years ago. So yeah.
This last year doesn't count. No one really knows what happened in this past. So just briefly about myself. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents, instead of moving east, they moved sort of northwest to Westchester County, New Rochelle, New York. Spent approximately 30 years with some stints here in Israel and a little bit in SUNY State University, New York, and Binghamton. And then spent a year here. Then I came back and got my doctorate in clinical psychology at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. At that point, I met my wife, Sarah Lee. At the time that I was when I finished my BA, the question was, do I want to go on to be a psychologist or to be a rabbi? And I said, well, a rabbi is not a good job for a good Jewish boy, especially in Israel, and especially a conservative rabbi. So all those things together, I got my doctorate in clinical psychology, which actually opened up a whole lot of doors for me here in terms of teaching in academic institutions and the like. And we made Aliyah in 1994. My wife and our first two kids, Ilana and Ma'ayan. We went on to have three other kids, Ayala, Einat, and Itai. Ma'ayan, our second born, is our first son, married 6 years ago. We have two grandkids. We seem to have another son-in-law along the way, but we won't tell anybody that I said that, and this is being recorded, so we can just ignore that. Our youngest son, Itai, just finished the army. On Monday, he cut his army identification card, and he'll actually be coming to the States, to New York, and he's hoping to. We'll be working at Camp Ramah, the day camp in Nyack, New York, and then he'll be spending the year working with. He hopes a couple of conservative communities in the New York metropolitan area. And he's looking, this is sort of his own privately arranged shlichut, his own sort of going out on a mission. In addition to being a rabbi, very part-time, it's sort of my moonlighting job. I'm primarily a psychologist. I have a clinic since I've been here for 27 years. Primarily, though not exclusively, ADHD and learning disabilities across the lifetime. I deal with kids and adults with autism. And then we all developed a very new specialty in the past year and a half of both how to deal with anxiety of a worldwide pandemic, of which there was, I would say, a dearth, but that would be an overestimate of how much research there was available on this, because we'd never experienced anything like this in the time where we were doing modern scientific psychological research. Like the last pandemic that really had this big of effect was 100 years ago, and at that point, really psychological research was in its nascent stages. So we were all going by the seat of our pants here, trying to figure out how to make use of this type of technology. You know, if someone said to me in, let's say, December 2019, would you ever do a remote session via a WhatsApp chat or a Zoom chat? I said, look, if I really had to, if one of my clients was abroad, I would say, all right, we can do one that way because it's really important to get to meet you. Today, if I were to say that, anybody would look at me and say, that's crazy. I have a woman who I will be doing an evaluation for her son next week. I don't remember what the day it is, but the first meeting I'm going to do over Zoom because she lives a little bit further away. to come into Jerusalem at 9 o'clock in the morning, just so we can sit. It would take her an hour and a half to get to me. We'd sit for an hour, and then she'd go back, and she said, well, why can't we just do this via Zoom? And so ultimately, that's what we're going to do. Obviously, for the evaluation, I have to see her son in person. But this is the kind of thing that we've all adapted to. And adapting to, I don't know exactly what you guys have done in Vancouver for shul. I know that in Israel, we've been moving a lot faster. Whatever one wants to say, and I don't want to make this obviously into any type of political discussion or any type of polemic of that kind, I can certainly say, and I think everybody, supporters and detractors alike, will say that Bibi Netanyahu handled the beginning of the pandemic very well. So between the months of February, the end of February, and the beginning of April until through just a bit after Pesach, like most of the world, we closed down. The other thing that I think we did very well, working very closely with our medical professions, was we opened up. So basically, from just after Shavuot of last year, so about a year and a month or 6 weeks, we have been in shul, in live. We had the advantage of it being always in the summer through certainly October. We could be outside comfortably with masks, with distancing, and I think that was, for the resilience of our community, was a very strong and powerful thing. We'll talk about, once we go on, we'll talk about how that really all came together. So that's basically the outline. And so what I want to do now is just sort of go through this presentation. I'm going to share my screen because it gives me an ability to really, there we go, let's see, there we go, to give me an opportunity to focus on how, to focus my thoughts. And what I'll do is I'll talk about something, I'll talk about a slide or so, and what I've learned from my students is every so often I'll stop for some questions. So if I think about the things that have been with me for the past year and a half, and I'm using the dates here, March 2020 to May 2021, those are the dates that I have in my head vis-a-vis how we handled this here in Israel. The dates will be different, maybe April 2020 to June, but that's the framework that I'm using. So there are two statements as a rabbi, as someone living here in Israel, really kept me focused over this past year. The first one was from Deuteronomy, "V'nishmatem me'od lenafshotechem," so watch yourselves very carefully. One of the things that the rabbis say in this pasuk, in this sentence, is that you should really take care of yourself. Make sure that what you're doing is healthy. So if someone says wear a mask, if someone says stay home, if someone says stay at a 2-meter distance from somebody else, that's what you should do. And the second thing was Kol Yisrael Arevim ze bazeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. All Jews, and I think what we can certainly say is, since biology doesn't know anything about religion, all people are responsible for one another. And I think it was very important for us to realize that by wearing a mask, by ultimately getting vaccinated, by staying at home when we were sick, we were really living through these two very important teachings, Jewish teachings, which I think are universal and should be looked at worldwide. And I think that was the two balances that we tried to make at all points. How to take care of myself, and keeping in mind that taking care of myself was also taking care of somebody else by design. I remember it was Pesach. I was walking home from shul, and I saw these guys. They were clearly from one of these North American yeshivot, and they were walking and they were yelling and they were laughing. And they didn't have any masks on, and I said to these two guys, "What are you doing?" And it turns out that they supported a previous president of the United States, and they said, we don't believe in this COVID-19, this coronavirus. It's all a conspiracy. And and I said, you may decide that that's true for yourself, but keep in mind that there are other people who don't want to get sick from you, and they basically just laughed and walked away. Fortunately, one of the things I developed over the course of a career was I said, let's not let people who don't understand what it is to live in a society, let's not let them get to you too much. So by the time I got home, I came home, had Kiddush, glass of wine, and everything was fine. So anyway, so I will talk about, so those are the two things that I kept in mind while I was preparing this. And I just want to go through very quickly a lot of the things that happened over the course of this year up until things started to open up. Again, I'm using this in Israel, and like I said before, there was a dearth of research on what to do about getting into a pandemic. There is even less on what to do getting out of a pandemic, but we'll talk about some of the recommendations as we go on. So I divide up how I looked at it with families. I divided up into a third, a third, a third. A third of the families I worked with, a third of my personal friend families, and it kind of goes up. Obviously, it's not exactly a third, a third, a third. We can kind of divide it up as to families who, being in lockdown after lockdown after lockdown, it was horrible for them. There was a third of the families who it didn't really make a difference so much to them on a day-to-day basis. I can take my brother who lives in Seattle. He works with Amazon Web Service, something like January 15th, 2020. They said, go home, come back by March 31st. He hasn't been back to Amazon offices in over a year and a half. They're just talking about maybe September that they'll start going back very slowly. So those are the kinds of things that, but his family did okay. He has 2 kids. His wife was did a lot of work online at home anyway. He did his work. They did okay. So there was a third that was horrible. There was a third that was really okay. It didn't make such a horrible impact on their lives. And then there was a third that actually, which I'll talk about very briefly, a third of the families who I know in my clinic who did actually very well. They didn't have to fight with their kids to get up to go to school early. They didn't have to fight with their kids to make sure they're on the bus or make sure they get to the kids woke up at 8 o'clock. They turned on the computer, and then all of a sudden they had this time that they never had before with their kids where they could watch them, and they decided that learning on Zoom for some kids just was not worth fighting over. And kids who would fight with their parents all the way up here for a long time, all of a sudden those things dropped down. I'll talk a little bit about more about that in a little while. There was clearly a significant increase with spousal abuse, which led to divorce or worse. The numbers that were reported in September, October of 2020 were frightening to the clinicians. Fortunately, I only had one case like that, where ultimately it was reversed. It was the woman who was abusing the man. And he said to me, what do I do? I said, call the hotline. It's only for women. It's not only for women. But it was, ultimately, they ended up separating. She ended up getting some anxiety medication, and it seems to be that they're going in the right direction. So, but there was a clear uptick in that, more than we would have seen given anything else. There was an uptick in child abuse, substance abuse. I didn't even know this thing called day drinking was a thing until someone said to me, Paul, you're doing a lot of day drinking. And I said, really? And they said, well, yeah, every time we see you on Zoom on Friday afternoon before Shabbat, you have a drink in your hand. And I said, oh, okay. So it was one of those kinds of things that we had to become aware of. Adults, adolescents, there was an increase on everybody's depression and anxiety, depression coming from loneliness, especially adults who really lived on their own. On the other hand, I look at my parents who were 80 and 82, and I saw them more frequently than I did because I saw them in this type of Zoom forum. Their community in Rochelle and in a lot of other communities around the world, all of a sudden, people got very busy. So for the first 3 or 4 months, my parents are very lonely. Now, virtually anytime I try to call them, they're busy on a shiur with this person, shiur with somebody in this country, in this city, and so they're quite busy. But in that time where it was unknown what was going on, there was a super increase in depression and anxiety. And the hardest thing was that people felt uncomfortable leaving their homes. And so you couldn't come even, and as much as I think that Zoom or WhatsApp chat or whatever it is a good substitute, it's only just that. It's a good substitute. It's not as good as in-person therapy. And again, I'm not primarily a telehelp therapist, so people will disagree with me. But I think the fact that people felt that they couldn't come out to get the help that they needed, although they were aware that they desperately needed it, led to the depression and anxiety going up on exponential levels, more so than just we would have expected by in any other in any type of emergency situation. And in Israel, sadly, we have any number of those emergency situations, and really because of the extended nature of this pandemic, even our long wars lately only last 6 or 8 weeks. So the country goes through this sort of adjustment period, but going on for a longer and longer time, it made people extremely depressed, extremely lonely, extremely anxious, and led to an increase in all sorts of other symptoms. So I'll stop for a moment. If anybody has any questions, again, I know that the research in most of the Western world is more or less the same. So I'm basing that some of it on the research, some of it on my experience, but I'm happy to take any questions before we go on to to what I see is happening as we are moving out of lockdown. Essentially, as of July 1st, we will have, as far as I understand, no restrictions placed on our movement, on our activities, and tourists will even be allowed to come back in, so buy your tickets. So any questions up till now? Either you didn't hear me or I was really clear or I didn't say anything new. Okay.
I was wondering about when we were talking about alcohol and we're talking about Zoom. And I know that it's very, I know we're shifting into this. We're gonna be shifting from understanding what has taken place and shifting into an idea of what's going to take place. And I almost, alcohol seems to be a substitute for happiness, right? And for fun and for joy. And I almost, and we know that sometimes it's necessary to dull our senses or to trade our emotions, but and we know that Zoom and what we've been in, this mode of online of what we've been in has been necessary. But I almost wonder if there's a parallel between Zoom and alcohol, that if there's a connection between them, that it's comforting, that it's not exactly real, but it also is very close to reality.
Well, people who have issues with substance abuse aside, what I'm about to say does not apply to people who, the AA motto, 100 isn't enough and 1 is too many, right? So the other thing, by the way, I say, and we're moving towards this, is that between alcohol and cannabis, the wrong one is still at least somewhat illegal. But if I would put those two, alcohol and cannabis, together, and then it's an interesting, Jonathan, it's interesting comment about Zoom, is that I'm the last psychologist that would say to anybody, never have a glass of red wine, never have a shot of whiskey. Sometimes that's what you need. You need something to come in when you're dealing with something that's making you too anxious to deal with it, just to kind of slow down your brain, because you can't think. Now, is it better to take an Ativan or Xanax or any of those things? The truth is, I think it's not better to take those medicines, because the prescription and the getting it there and getting it, and you run out. And we've seen a lot of opiate addictions. You can clearly become addicted to alcohol and in high doses also to cannabis. But I think it helps us in a way, and I never thought of it this way, but in the same way that Zoom is, it provides a substitute for reality that for a certain amount of time could be useful. The question is, what happens next? Do we remain here? Now, my father, who gets chemotherapy, so his immune system is severely compromised. He all of a sudden looks back and says, why didn't I wear a mask all the time? Why didn't the rabbis in our community offer Zoom lessons all the time so I could stay here and not expose myself? Now, thank God he's doing okay, right? And so, you know, I went to visit him with my wife and 3 of our kids on Pesach, and that was pretty good. And his doctor said, and he was vaccinated, we were vaccinated, and it all worked fine. But I think in terms of strategies of dealing with something, if you're doing it under the right supervision with friends and family and community, I think anything can be used for a time. The question is, what do you do tomorrow? Or what do we do in September, or what we would call Tishrei of next year, of this coming year? And then what happens after? Do you do some type of a mix? And it's not going to be an easy question to address on a community or congregational level, I can imagine. But I think that the substitute and the crutches of dealing with an imposed reality like a pandemic have to be looked at totally differently than what you do in your everyday life. If the only way you can get through a day is to have a glass of red wine morning, noon, and night, then maybe that's a problem that you should seek help for. If the only way you can get through a day is by having this type of interaction from Zoom, now that's wonderful because it opens up Vancouver and Jerusalem, and that's terrific. On the other hand, if that's the only way you can do it, not because it's just simpler because your job doesn't require you to go anyplace, but because it makes you extremely anxious at dealing with people, then you have to figure out why. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use this forum. It doesn't mean that this forum is a bad forum. It just means you have to understand why and do it, as we say, lechatchila, do as an a priori decision and not a b'diavad, an after the fact decision. Understanding, and this I believe is true in any area, whether it's Judaism and religion, whether it's psychology, whether it's mathematics, whether it's biology, the understanding can give you a basis to then say, now I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'll figure out how to do it in a healthy way rather than in an unhealthy way. I hope that addresses at least some of the question.
Absolutely, thanks. By the way, when you come to Canada, cannabis is legal here, but
you'll have to take me out.
Not that I've actually ever taken advantage of that legality, but.
So, yeah, all right. Yeah, we rabbis, we like to brag that we know where it's legal. Doesn't mean we've done anything, but yeah, that's okay. So, all right. Any other quick questions before we go on? All right. So again, what I spoke about before, families and couples, strengthen the connection. My wife is a cantor, and for 13 years, up until this past year, she was in one of 2 communities in the United States for Yamim Noraim, for high holidays. This is the first year in 13 years we actually had the high holidays together, because she did a lot of recording, pre-preparation. She logged on to them a little bit in Dresher, Pennsylvania, but we were actually together. We spent more time than we would have thought we were going to be together. And I'm not just saying this because this is what happened with me, but I've spoken to any number of different people who have said, you know what, spending this time together strengthened our connection. we were able to re-find each other in a way that wasn't threatening and wasn't totally lonely. So many people get divorced when the last kid moves out because they don't remember who they are. But here they had to find each other, re-find each other, and the kids were still home. And so it actually made it made it as something that wasn't horrible. Would I have traded it off? There are certain aspects, no. Yes, there would probably have been a better way to do it, that it wasn't forced from the outside. But I think it improved my own relationship. And again, I'm not talking because this is who I am, but I see it in my practice. And again, some of the research is beginning to say that certain couples actually reported that this was actually very good for them. And certain families said they learned how to get along better. There was an increase in intimacy, both physical, emotional, and everything. And the term that psychologists coined, over a generation ago, quality time. I don't like that, but I think it gets the message across. Excuse me. All of a sudden, people were able to figure out what to do with this quality time, because you can watch Netflix for 24 hours and you can do that for 7 days, but eventually Netflix runs out and eventually your eyes fall out. There were families who said, we all of a sudden reopened up our board games and played cards that we hadn't done in 10 or 15 years. And it made for conversation, it made for interactions that they hadn't had with their kids, adult and otherwise, for more than a year, and sometimes for more than 15 years. So that kind of thing was very good. Again, I don't think that this was the majority of families. I don't think that this was the majority of couples, but I do believe, and I do know from some of the Springer research, that there was some of that did go on. Okay, so now I say May 2021, right? In Israel, we have 6.8 million vaccinated plus recovered people, whatever that herd immunity thing means. And I call this next session, what to expect when expecting, because we're expecting to come out of this soon. So when we have close to 3/4 of our population who we believe are immune because of either the vaccination or having recovered and taken a vaccination or not taken a vaccination, serology tests say that they have the antibodies. Like I said, we are pretty close to opening up fully. We can now have shul services inside with up to 300 people in a room that fits 500 people. So we are pretty much close to pre-pandemic normal. And again, as far as I understand, on July 1st, we're coming back to that. So what would we expect and what are we seeing? So here I'll say adults who are either single or in a relationship. We're seeing that they are having this sort of combination of jubilation and anxiety. I can actually go out to a restaurant. I can actually go see a movie in a movie theater. I can actually go see a concert. I can actually, whatever you fill in the blank. That is so exciting. It's overwhelmingly exciting. It's wonderful. But then you get there and boom, you see someone playing the trumpet and you start to wonder how much of whatever is in that person's breath is coming out through the trumpet and facing me. And that puts you in an anxious state. And what people are reporting is they're not only anxious now about COVID-19 because they believe that the coronavirus is more or less under control. Whether that's true or false is not even relevant. But they said, who knows what else this person has? He or she is blowing out a trumpet, but who knows what they're blowing out the trumpet? Something I never thought of before. So that leads to a sense of anxiety, right? And I was in the grocery store yesterday and I put my mask on, even though the law doesn't require me to, because there are people coughing and there are people sneezing. And then all of a sudden you wonder, why didn't I do this in the past? And anxiety is one of those things that is a current, future, and you can be anxious about the past that had no effect, and then you get more anxious again. So it's one of those cycling emotions that we psychologists say, look, first of all, understand that the fact that you didn't wear a mask 5 years ago doesn't have to make you anxious today. Right, that's really easy to say, but that doesn't mean it works. And because the way the brain works is we're anxious about something, it reminds us about everything else that we ever could be anxious about. It then spirals at anxiety. And sometimes I'll say anxiety and depression are interrelated. They're very similar on brain function. And it's basically how the person interprets the stimulus that they're getting. But it's both of those at once, the jubilation and anxiety and depression, and it is really confusing. How online dating, right? You never had to see a person. Now, we can say anything you want about millennials and Gen X and Gen Z. They had been expecting to come in and start forming relationships now, and it's hard. It's not easy to do. And now they really have to start meeting people, and people were scary. I remember one of my first thoughts that I had sometime in March of 2020 as I was walking out of my clinic, and I was thinking any of these people could be dangerous to me. Now, in Israel, I was crossing the street, so that was also dangerous, as Rabbi Infeld said before, but not just anybody walking in the street. And now I'm having to understand that those people are not so scary, because we're not as contagious as we were a year and a half ago, and probably we're all very little contagious. There's been very little spread. Israel, I think there was a day last week we had no new cases. Some point we've had 4 or 5 new cases. Many are people who are coming in who slipped through the tests or faked their test, unfortunately. But whatever, so we're really not anxious. But still, what I'm seeing in my clinic is now that people are able to go back and begin to partake in life, they're feeling extremely anxious, more than even people who weren't anxious before are getting extremely anxious, just because we don't know what this whole thing means, and we don't know what we're gonna meet. Adolescence, 15 to 18, and I say I don't know when adolescence actually ends. You know, for some of my kids, you know, my 30-year-old is no longer an adolescent. Our 29-year-old is somewhat more of an adolescent, right? But we have succeeded in extending adolescence beyond, 18 or 22 or into the 30s. But as a group, if I say the high school students, they actually did pretty well after the age of 15 or 16. In general, yeah, it was annoying for them to be on Zoom, but because what adolescents do, excuse me a second. That's coffee, not dark beer, just so you know. It's still early in the morning. Because they tend to look at rules as recommendations, adolescents worldwide between the ages of 15 and 18 found the ways to meet each other. And since they didn't have to get up in the morning so early, they didn't mind, and their parents didn't mind. They were up till 3 in the morning, sitting outside. And again, in Israel, for most of the months of this pandemic, our kids could be outside speaking with one another, playing with one another, meeting each other. They, as a group, again, we're talking statistics, as a group, that group of adolescents, 15 to 18, did really okay. We have the 12 to 15-year-olds, which I'll talk about in a minute, and I'll put them together with preschool students. The school-age students, the 6 to 12-year-olds, they suffered a lot. They suffered a lot because the place that they are supposed to mix was school. The place that they're supposed to learn how to be with each other was school, and this was not a good substitute for developing those social interactions. So they suffered, but because kids are resilient, what we're seeing is that once they start to get back into life, they pick up where they left off. And even if they left off a year ago, and again, as statistically speaking, I always say this, right? Ezu chacham halober mikol adam. Who is a wise person is someone who learns from anybody. So I always say that before I say, Stalin said, right? 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic. So, and Stalin created a lot of statistics along the way, but this as a statistic, the school age kids 6 to 12, they did okay, and they will do okay because of the nature of the resilience and where they were developmentally. Preschool kids, those who are like 4 to 6, and the 12 to 15-year-olds, they're the ones that we see are really struggling because, and I predict that we'll see an increase certainly with the 12 to 15-year-olds with anxiety, because up until 12, friends are friends, and you either run with them or you play dolls with them or you play blocks with them or you play ball with them, and that's what you do. From 12 to 15, you start to develop relationships. And this is not the forum to develop relationships, as great as it can be. And people will disagree with me. This is just not the best forum for that. We didn't evolve to create relationships with talking heads. We evolved to create relationships with entire people. And that's why these two groups are doing poorly, the preschool kids, because they couldn't really get this sense, right? We laugh with our grandson when he looks at the camera and he smiles and he thinks it's me and he says Saba and he says Bubby, and it kind of looks like us, but it's a whole different interaction when he's a year old and he's in my arms for him and for me. And our 3-year-old, sometimes he had the patience to look at me this way, sometimes he didn't. And but it was, our grandson then, it was much more difficult for them. Again, I believe that they will do well because they're biologically motivated to do well. And I really think that the 12 to 15-year-olds we're going to see in the next 2 to 3 years are going to have a big hump to get over because they missed a really significant portion of how to develop those interpersonal interactions. And for some of them, it might actually be critical. It might have been critical that they say you can't, it's really easy to learn a language up until the age of 9. That's more or less true. You can learn a language even after 9. Uvda ani medaber ivrit, but it doesn't really work, and it's harder. Will they survive? Most will survive. Will it be difficult with them because there is that specific period of 12 to 15 that was truly crucial for them, that we're talking about 6th, 7th, 8th graders? I think we're going to see there's going to be a really long lag on their emotional and interpersonal development. So I'll stop here again for some questions, and then we'll go on to I'll end on a more positive, on some don'ts and some do's on how I think we can proceed, from June, July 2021 in Israel, and then when you guys in Canada catch up to us and getting most of your people vaccinated, then you can join us too. So any questions till now?
Yeah, I had a question if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that you had an experience working with people with some developmental disorders such as autism. And I was wondering, you mentioned quite a wide swath of people, preschoolers, adolescents, adults. I was wondering what your experience was with adults and children with autism who are struggling, were they struggling during Zoom? Was it better for them not to have so much in-your-face social interaction?
Yeah. So it's Grace, right? The real advantage of this thing is that everybody's name comes up. Now, of course, sometimes they're sitting with it could be that they're sitting with their partner's name, but here Grace gets highlighted, so we're doing great. So anyway, I can speak only from anecdotal experience because, again, we don't have enough research. But my anecdotal experience is that adolescents on the autism spectrum, 50-50. And literally, I'm working now with 6 families with autistic adolescents, and 3 of them suffered horribly because they also have severe attention problems. And so sitting in class with enough medication, etc., they did okay, and the social interactions, they were learning them. All of a sudden, they were cut off from all of that experience, and they wanted to. Again, they were 14 and 15. What typically happens with autism over the course of a life is that up until 12 or 13, they say, well, he didn't care that he was being teased, or she didn't notice that she was being teased, or they didn't figure it out, so it was all okay. And then all of a sudden, adolescence decides that you have to now be involved with your peers. So that's when it kicks in for kids on the autistic spectrum as well, and it was difficult for them. I would say that another 50%, this was great. This was great because all of a sudden they could develop real peer interactions with real peers who they would meet eventually. And it was really an interesting study for these three adolescents who they turned 15 to 17 during this past year. They had been developing these online interactions with people all over the world. And although for many, and psychologists, there's a lot of research on this, say that can be a really good community for them, what we found out is that didn't help them integrate into society, because they never saw the people they were meeting in China and Japan and Canada and in the United States and England. They only could interact with them on this box. Now what actually happened with some of these kids is they were able to show some of their talents because they were only talking heads, and they didn't have to worry about the anxiety that was being forced upon them by being with other kids all the time. But they then met other kids who they saw in these boxes. So they became real. So it actually allowed for a certain population and a certain sector of the population with autism to practice here and then put it into reality with people who they could actually meet, even though their development, the relationship developed in this form. So it was a very interesting interaction. Again, I'm talking anecdotally. There is very little research yet to come out, but I suspect that that's what we're going to see. Again, I have a lot of degrees. Navi, a prophet, is not one of them. But I suspect and I predict that that's what we're going to see, that we're going to see, excuse me, that some of these kids actually, this was excellent for their social emotional development, because kids, and here I'll put kids and adults, because all of a sudden they had the ability to interact, and then they had the ability to practice those interactions because people were able to see them as a different person. And they were able to see them as a person who could have an interaction. And then they could then say, oh, you know what? Paul isn't so weird after all. And it actually worked out much better. Any other questions?
Paul, I have a question from the floor, and I have my own question.
Mm-hmm.
So this, I'll give you both of them at one time, if that's okay. They're totally separate, so I think you'll be able to handle both. One is if you might be able to address what happened with senior care homes in Israel during the pandemic. Were families able to visit? Did they facilitate Zoom visits? If you can address that. The second one is I'm gonna tell you a story. At some point last week, I had a dream nightmare, and it was in anticipation of the province has recently decided not to fight the houses of worship anymore. And as of July 1st, there will be no mandates against gatherings in synagogues and churches and mosques, ... There will be guidelines, but no mandates. So I literally had a nightmare that I was in a synagogue with hundreds of people. Or maybe it was somewhere, I don't know. It wasn't
your show, obviously. Yeah. Okay.
No, of course it was mine, but it was a nightmare of I'm in a space with lots and lots of people. It's clear that I have a deep-seated anxiety, I suppose, already, that developed over the year of being in the presence of. So what about for us as adults, and many of us are seniors here on this Zoom, that we haven't had that interaction? How do we deal with the anxiety? Knowing that, and actually in probably 1 month from now, the majority of the people on this call will be 3 weeks out from their second vaccine. So they'll be 95% covered. It will be safe. 95% of all the people, at least coming into our synagogue, will have had 2 vaccines and be 3 weeks out, in a month to 2 months. But we still have that deep-seated anxiety of being trained. We've been trained over the last year and a half. Don't go within 2 meters of anyone. Don't be close talking to anyone. Our natural reaction now is to pull away from someone. How do we deal with that anxiety as adults and as seniors?
Yeah. So the first question is between, again, I'm using the dates here in Israel, between February and April or May. No, it was a little less. It was February to March and the beginning of April. The senior residents did a horrible job on protecting the physical health of their residents. Again, I don't blame anybody. I think no one understood what was going on, but they did a horrible job. And for a very long time, most of the people who were getting sick and ultimately, unfortunately, dying were in places that were assisted and protected living homes. That seems to be a crazy statistic. We then switched the pendulum the other way and isolated them terribly. And then I remember on Holocaust Remembrance Day here in Israel, the many Holocaust survivors said, "You're making me die alone. Allow me to choose how I want to die." Because that was how that's how we were here. You can't go out. Well, wait a minute. I'm 85 years old. I survived the Holocaust. I want to be able to go see my grandchildren, even if at the risk of my own health, right? So, let me decide how to take care of that. Once the summer rolled around, and once we could really be outside and we figured out how to visit, I think that like in many other areas, the model was we can be outside most evenings in Jerusalem and most evenings any place else in Israel. You could be outside comfortably, and then I think that everybody adjusted to it, including the senior residents. I think that in general, let's put it, I haven't heard any news since I haven't heard any news about senior residents specifically about coronavirus and COVID-19 in, let's say, the better portion of 6 months. So I guess things are better under control there. And yeah, absolutely. That's what I said. I'll show the screen and show you here we go, right? It's all expected. So yeah, your response, Jonathan, is exactly the response that everybody's happening. I guess basically I say the fact that we don't have a separation between religion or synagogue and state in Israel is a bad thing. But here I can say the country certainly worked with houses of worship, right? Because from June of 2020, we were able to be back together in some form or another. And all the reports say that by and large, the synagogues, except in certain areas, were responsive and reactive and stayed within the guidelines. And the same could be said of the churches and mosques. That we also did okay in terms of observing and making sure that whatever guidelines were, we weren't going to infect anybody else. But the anxiety is all expected. And it's not that I wish I had a nickel, because I get more than a nickel every time someone tells me that type of dream. But yeah, those types of dreams are normal. Not only, if you didn't have that type of a dream, or you didn't have that type of a worry, I would say, what's wrong? Why aren't you worried about going back together? Because for a year and a half, we've been told that anybody over here, anybody is a dangerous person. And it's not just because they could be, God forbid, a mass murderer, but because they could cough and sneeze at you and you're going to get really deathly ill. Now, the truth is that was true beforehand, and you get viruses, and you get cold, and you get strep throat, and you get really sick. But now we were acutely aware of it. So I would say that one of the things that's important to do, and that brings me to the wrapping up section, is everything, dreams, anxieties, expressed anxieties, not wanting to shake hands. I didn't shake hands with people in my clinic. And now all of a sudden I said, you know what? Maybe I can. And so there's a guy who's leaving for the States. He's going to the States for the first time. A guy I've been treating for over a year and a half. He's going to the States for the first time next week. I shook his hand and I said, go have a great time. And he said, wow, you haven't shaken my hand in a year and a half since we met. We met just before the pandemic. And I said, yeah, didn't that feel really good? And he said, wait a minute, who's the therapist here? And I said, at that moment, we're both our therapists because kol arevim ze bazeh, we all have to take care of each other. So I think that if you don't have that type of worry, either you're really a well put together person, or you're really out of it and not knowing what's going on. So what do I think? And then I saw there was a question about 12-year-olds and Hebrew school. Sorry, I see that star is in the place. One of the things I think we should not do is don't make up for lost, whatever it happens to be, school material, social skills. Don't try to make up for it, right? Because when you try to make up, you're always going to be behind the 8 ball. You're always going to be doing things wrong. I'm hoping that teachers in Kita Bet in 2nd grade will look at most of their students and pupils next year as kids who need to start from ABCs, from Aleph Bet. I'm hoping that kids in 7th and 8th grade meet their teachers and they say, okay, we're going to assume that you are about half a year behind, that we don't have to make up for it because you're never going to make up for it. We're not going to make up for the lost time, right? And this was an article just came out. Respondents uniformly suggested a preference for gradually restarting activities. So maybe what you need to do is, even if the province doesn't say you shouldn't have a whole lot of people there, or doesn't prevent you from doing it, maybe you should just do it slowly. Say, okay, we want to have as many people in by Rosh Hashanah. How do we do that? Not on a medical safety level, because like you said, everybody in there is 95% safe. So 95% and 95%, and so we're all 99.9% safe, whatever that means, right? Because that 0.1 is really bad. But do it gradually, rather than saying, okay, wow, we're gonna come in, we're gonna have a 3-hour service, and we're gonna have a 2-hour Kiddush, and we're gonna do all this all at once. Let's do it rotations. Do a shorter service. I don't think anybody will mind doing a shorter service every once in a while. Our Rosh Hashanah service typically here in Jerusalem was 4 or 5 hours. We did it in 2.5, and we did 3 different rotating services. So I assume by Rosh Hashanah we'll do it differently this year. But when we started with 10 people who all were committed to being there when we started at either 8:30 or 9 o'clock, depending upon the season. And they all had a job, either reading Torah or davening or doing something. So we made sure there was 10 people, and then it was 15, and then it was 20. Now we were getting the guidelines from the state, so we had an excuse. But I think you have to think about that as well, is that everybody's going to walk in the door but it's expected. I expect people to be worried. And I think that what the kind of things that we should do, right, is do make up for lost times with other family, right, by spending time with friends, right? And then ensure that the venue is organized in such ways to make desired behaviors possible, right? And this is another one from 2021. And then communication, and I actually coined these 3 words, although this is what they were talking about: communication, education, and participation. I think it's really important. One of the things that we that we see and that we saw is that because we had actually a guy who was involved in a lot of the decisions, he's a member of our shul, he was able to really communicate what was going on. If I say what really helped here in Israel for most of the past year and a half is that there was a very clear message. This is what we should do, and this is why we are doing it. So if on July 1st, you can theoretically have 300 people in your sanctuary, decide, you can't make a decision from the top down, but decide with the community, you only have a couple of weeks, do we really want to do that? Because my concern as a psychologist and a rabbi is that, I don't know if 300 people would show up, but 200 people might show up and you might spook 25% of them and then they won't come back again. And then the problem with anxiety is that it is extremely contagious. So if I'm anxious and then they're anxious and then they're anxious, you might actually push people away rather than telling them that you should come in. So maybe, I don't know if you have to do it 20, but maybe you do 50 and then you do a different 50 and you do some on Friday night and you do some on Shabbat morning and you have a morning meeting that does it a little bit with smaller groups of people. I think the education is then also why we're doing this and really, really understanding that this is a process to get back, because ultimately we want to get back into this full participation. We want to be able to come back into the situation that says, I don't know if the world will ever return to where it was pre-pandemic, but we want to encourage participation because as human beings, we are social and cultural beings. And if we don't have that, one of the things that I thought was horrible is we were calling this social distancing. It was actually physical distancing. No one thought enough about the term. And so what I always said is we want to keep physical distance and maintain as best as we can social closeness. Zoom helped to that to some degree. And I think that that's what we need to do is we need to increase the participation by telling people why we're doing it and by telling people what we're doing. And by telling people that those dreams are normal, natural response to a situation that was scary and you're coming out. Is the world, this is one of the debates on psychology forums now, is the world going through a worldwide post-trauma stress reaction? Anybody that says everything, always, or anybody is wrong, right? I never say never, and I never say always. But I think that we are seeing a lot of stress and nightmares, bad dreams, night terrors are really an example of how people should be told that, yes, that is a natural thing, whether it's some imaginary shul, whether it's some imaginary sporting event, whether those types of things are going to be scary. I looked at, I'm a diehard New York Mets fan. And so I've been watching their shortened games because they play at 2 a.m. for Israel time. And all of a sudden I saw the bleachers were pretty full. And I said, wow, that sounds really cool. Now, of course, they're outside, so it's not as big of a worry. But I think that's an important thing to say. There's a difference between being inside and being outside. Most of the research said that there was none or very little transmission outdoors. So that's a pretty good statistic. So that's something to educate people about. You can have the Kiddush outside when it's nice enough. All sorts of things, but you want to really encourage people to be together and not make them be afraid of what's actually going on. And I just want to see that one chat question that somebody put. Where'd it go?
Just to make sure you understand, Hebrew school here means the Jewish day school, and the Jewish day schools were completely open when the public schools were not.
So just a
rephrasing for you to understand, the question is, do you think the fact that kids who were in Jewish day school were able to go to school this entire year, 5 days a week, keragil, do you think that will impact them differently?
Absolutely, because they did what they were supposed to do. One of the kids, one of the adolescents I treated, he had a very good reaction, and he said what was great. And now I'll talk about kids in regular classrooms. He said it was great. You know, we had 2 special ed classrooms. We were the only ones in the school. We could have the whole school. He said, I don't want these other kids to come back anymore, even though I have some friends in their class. But his emotional and social development was actually not arrested. He did actually quite fine. And so, yeah, I think that the kids who carried on with their lives more or less normal from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., whatever the hours are, right? I think they will probably be able to use those as what we call a social control group, right? Because we'll be able to say, okay, this cohort of kids went and had their normal interactions. And then we'll look at the public school kids who are doing it via Zoom or whatever platform, and we'll see how they are at 14 or 15 in a year or two, and see. I would predict that we'll see far less of the impact. Again, I don't know what they did with the shuls, but 12-year-olds aren't the ones who are always, even in religious families, they aren't the ones who are always running to shuls. I would certainly predict that kids who were in school more or less regular hours for this year, as long as they didn't have any illness or deaths in the family due to COVID-19, will look back at this and say, what's the big deal? I saw my friends all the time and we're all doing fine. So I think that will...
Oh, yeah. I wanted to say thank you, Paul. Were you finished? I thought you were just finished, but
yeah. So I was going to say thank you too.
Oh, great. so
yeah. You. So if anybody has any,
I just wanted to make one little correction though, because in Vancouver, the one major difference in Vancouver, what we've seen over the last 2 years, it's just increasing. People have been saying, Rabbi, please speak longer and take those services longer. No, I'm just kidding.
But that's just a personal comment, right?
So Paul, thank you so much for this wonderful overview and insight and your knowledge and experience and breadth of study is absolutely fascinating. I want to just finish with a little bit of Torah. That I for those of you who were with me a couple of weeks ago, I spoke about Pesach Sheni, and you might connect with this, Paul. And it was something I had studied. I looked at a piece, and for those of you who may know, remember, there's this concept that if you weren't able to celebrate Pesach because you're in a state of ritual impurity, you're allowed to do it a month later in what's called Pesach Sheni. So I read a commentary that asked the question, why is it that the person who does Pesach Sheni does the Paschal offering, gives the, eats the matzah and the bitter herbs, but doesn't retell the story. And then the explanation, and it goes on to say, well, Pesach, the real Pesach is past, that's gone forever. You can fulfill your mitzvah of the chiyuv, of the obligation of the ritual, but you'll never actually be able to recover that full experience again that you missed in the study of the Seder. And so what you were saying, Paul, really connected to that particular devar, because I explained, people they'll check off the box, they graduated, they celebrated their 70th birthday, they celebrated their 80th birthday, whatever it is, but it won't have been exactly the same way. And unfortunately, we emotionally have to let go of the fact that we couldn't tell the story of Pesach, that we couldn't celebrate that special birthday that we wanted to, but we have to acknowledge that we checked off that box and now we're moving on. Is that?
I think that's really important, is to say, we're not going to make it up. It's not going to be, I'm going to have my 70th birthday a year late. It's not the same. But so don't try to make up for it. You can't make up for Pesach, right? It's just not possible, but we'll do the next best thing. And I think that's a really important message to end up with.
Thank you. And so thank you again to you, especially for waking up so early. I have to say that if the roles were reversed, I would say, what are you? There's no way I'm waking up at 5:30 in the morning. But thank you for doing it.
Well,
and
you see, I'm here. I'm going to play this card. I'm just a little bit older than you, Jonathan, so I wake up at 5:30 anyway.
I understand. I'm already there anyway. So, and please join us next week. And you may want to join us as well, Paul, next week. As you may know, Rabbi Miles Cohen is going to be joining us, and he's really the world's expert on Ta'amei Mikra, on Torah reading, and on Tefillah. And he's an incredible scholar of Tefillah and the author of the Luach. Many of us have had an opportunity to study with him when he's been in Vancouver already. And he's going to be doing an hour session on everything you wanted to know about Tefillah, but we're afraid to ask. So come with your questions about Tefillah, about Torah reading, and it's a very different topic, but Miles Cohen is truly a gift to the Jewish people, and we have the zchut, we have the merit to study with him.
Do send me the link, because my wife actually studied with him, so she might.
It's the same link, same exact link as this.
All right.
Next week.
So July 1st, come to Israel. Everybody's invited to come. You know, you have to. We may even recognize your vaccination certificates by then. Excuse me, and then I'll be happy to come and visit you in Vancouver.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, everybody, for this. I guess we're all signing off now.
Oh, Paul?
Yeah.
Oh, here. Maybe I just want to, Sam, would you mind?
I sent him my email. I saw the message while you were talking. I sent him my email directly.
Okay, to Randy. Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we're all set there. I was just trying to make the shidduch. Okay.
Hi, thank you. It's Randy. I'm here. Yes, Sam is signed in on his computer. I'm going to send you an email. I work with all the top experts for autism in the world and all the organizations. So I'd love to talk to you about what you're doing and see if I can be of assistance to you as well.
Great. That sounds wonderful.
All right. So it'll be you'll see my name, Randy, at the P2P.
Okay.
Okay, terrific. Toda rabba.
Okay.
Paul, I have a quick question for you if you have a minute afterwards. I just want to ask you a quick question. Thank you.
Dr. Fox?
Yeah.
I have a question I didn't have a chance to ask. I'm just not sure if I should since you're trying to go. I'll make it really quick. It was about, you said depression, I gather you meant among adults, was on the increase. I'm a student of World War II, and certainly in Britain during the war, when it was at its worst, depression and suicide were down. It was, people's mental health was more robust. And I think there are a couple of reasons for it, but certainly the isolation is one. During the war, people did not isolate. They worked together to do what they needed to do. And it just makes me wonder whether we couldn't, if another pandemic comes around, figure out a way to have people less isolated. You know, maybe the bubbles could be the neighborhood rather than just the family, something.
Yeah, look, I hope we don't have to take any lessons from this into any future pandemics. Right, but I'm not that optimistic that we won't have any future pandemics. War, I mean, is a really interesting phenomenon. Is that it tends to, in general, at least for a certain period of time, increase morale. there is something unique about war that really changes the way people look at what they need to do. And they rally behind the flag in real and figurative ways that makes those types of things, depression and suicide, potentially go down to drop. But I think you're right, is that the issue of isolation is a big thing. And look, I think that, I don't know the comparative statistics between the increase of depression and anxiety in Israel, where we were always outside meeting people, as opposed to Canada or other places. But I do know that, that we still had that uptick, even though we were having, the capsules or the bubbles of, 15 or 20 people. And on the other hand, families on our block with young kids, they decided that they were their Corona families. And so they had Shabbat dinners together. They took that into their own hands. And those kids and those adults seem to have been doing better. They had 3 families together, I'm thinking of. And they seem to do a lot better.
Well, could I say another quick question about a quick thing about war? One of the things about certainly Second World War, certainly in the Allied countries, is everybody had jobs to do.
Right.
They had to grow vegetables in the garden. They had to save scrap metal for aircraft. They all had jobs to do. And maybe that's something that we need to think about for future crises. Everybody needs to be able to contribute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night. Have a great day. That was my question, Paul. Thank you. All right.
All right. Yeah. So you can do it to my cell phone number, Jonathan, and then I can accept the money.
Oh, can you you just email me your cell phone number? I may already have it, but
you get it.